Some of you that are very astute may have caught this in my earlier comments, but I have a confession to make to you, and that is that we're skipping 3 chapters of Matthew right now. Before our missionary was here last week, I had just finished Matthew 22, and we're skipping chapters 23, 24, and 25, and we'll be in Matthew 26 this morning. The reason for that is not because I'm necessarily scared of those chapters, though they do. A couple of them do deal with prophecy, which is always intimidating. I am trying to get us to the resurrection on Easter Sunday, and I just can't make it through 3 extra chapters to do so by Easter. So we're already going to be charging a little bit, but I am skipping to chapter 26 today. Lord willing, after Easter, we're planning on doing a mini-series on fear. So we'll be talking on the topic of fear for a few weeks, and then we'll be back to Matthew to finish out these chapters 23, 24, and 25. Chapter 23 is a chapter of prophetic woes where it's the final section of Jesus' teaching. So Jesus teaches against the Pharisees in chapter 23 and this kind of empty religion that he confronts in chapter 23. And then in chapters 24 and 25, he talks about end-time prophecy. And it's fascinating. I think you'll find it very interesting. I'm looking forward to that as well. Always intimidating for me to do prophecy, but we'll be exploring that together. That'll be a little ways down the stream here. So we're skipping, but we're coming back to these chapters as we'll close out Matthew, kind of a little bit odd, so that we can get to this on Easter. So we're in chapter 26 here today. This is after the teaching section, 23, 24, 25. It jumps into back to this narrative section that leads us from this moment to the cross and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let me just want to highlight this section with some thoughts from D.A. Carson in his book, God with Us. He writes this: few individuals leap from the pages of history with more profound irony attached to their lives than does the Lord Jesus Christ. And Matthew was aware of this fact. Matthew, noted that Jesus experienced hunger but fed others. He grew weary and gave rest to others. Although he was King Messiah, he paid tribute. He was called the devil but cast out demons. He died the death of a sinner but came to save people from their sins. He was sold for 30 pieces of silver. He gave his life as a ransom for many. He who would not turn stones to bread for himself gave his own body as bread for the people. But nowhere is this irony more pervasive than in Christ's death. His enemies believed they were destroying him, but little did they understand that the destruction they achieved was God's means for redeeming a fallen world. Messiah's enemies thought that they inflicted the ultimate defeat, but in God's wise providence, that defeat was Messiah's greatest triumph. Here on page 153 of God with Us. I thought that's how D.A. Carson begins this section that we're jumping into today. Our passage begins today with Jesus telling his followers, it's time. The time has come. You know, Jesus' story from the book of Matthew even, Jesus many times before has kind of dodged an angry mob, and the point was his time had not yet come. He had told people that he had healed. Don't tell others, because his time wasn't meant to be right then and there. But right here in our passage, we see Jesus finally announce, it's time. It's coming. It's right here upon us. And that's what our section begins here. This definitive road to his cross and to his resurrection. And so we're going to explore this narrative section together, and I believe find some valuable lessons along the way. Today in chapter 26, in these opening 30 verses of chapter 26, I want you to see love and its orientation. Love and its orientation. And what we see in chapter 26 here is we see 2 examples of each, but we see 2 paths. One path is the path of self-centered love. And self-centered love says, you pay for me. And we also see in this section, we see the path of selfless love. And selfless love says, I will pay for you. And so we'll see this contrasted actually twice in this section. Let me read it with you, and then we'll explore together. Matthew 26, verse 1 says this. Now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, that he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Then the chief priests, the scribes, the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. And when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil. And she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor. But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. And then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time, he sought opportunity to betray him. Now at the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where do you want us to prepare you to eat the Passover? And he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And so the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When evening had come, he sat down with the 12. Now as they were eating, he said, assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were exceedingly sorrowful. And each of them began to say to him, Lord, is it I? And he answered and said, he who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me. The Son of Man indeed goes just as is written, but woe to him, that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. And then Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? And he said to him, you have said it. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Here's a text that tells us about love and its orientation. And as I mentioned, there's two paths in front of us. There's two paths in this text. One is the path of self-centered love that says, you pay for me. And the other is the path of selfless love, which says, I will pay for you. There's two illustrations of both. Let me walk through these with you. The first is the path of self-centered love. You pay for me. And it's found in the religious leaders. Right after Jesus in this text says, my time is here. It's going to happen. Right after that, the text says in verse 3, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, all the religious leaders are gathered together. And they're where? The text tells us they're at the home of the high priest. His name is Caiaphas. And it's one of those, it should seem a little odd to us. Not just because the religious leaders are gathered, they're gathered at the home of the high priest, but what they're gathered about. They're plotting together to do what verse 4 tells us. The religious leaders are plotting together how they're going to deceitfully trap and murder someone. It'd be like if the pastors and deacons of Ingleside are like getting together at my house after church, and we're like, we're going to murder someone. I mean, this should shock us, right? This would be like, what is going on here? What are they doing? The religious leaders are gathering together, and they're like, how can we get Jesus, and how can we get rid of him? It should be shocking to us. It's a vivid portrayal of such self-centered love. Us and ours and our kingdom building versus Jesus and his kingdom. It's a self-love on full display for us, even in these religious leaders. It was a love that didn't say, I will pay for you. It was a love for that what? That said, he has to pay for us. For us to be advanced, he has to go. And that's what self-centered love says. There is a sacrifice with love. The reality of love is that says, you're going to pay for me to feel loved, or I'm going to pay for you to feel loved. Typically, that's how it works, right? There's sacrifice involved with love. And the religious leaders put on display, where's the sacrifice going to take place? He's going to pay, not us, right? It's self-centered love that says, you pay for me. What drives them is interesting in this passage. We know from the context that these religious leaders were jealous of Jesus. They viewed his teaching as erroneous. They viewed it as blasphemous. They viewed themselves as biblically right and Jesus biblically wrong. And so there was a religiosity to their own self-righteousness. But here in verse number 5, in the direct context of this passage, we see one of their fears on display. I mentioned we're going to do a mini-series on fear. And in fear, it reveals a lot about our heart. Here in this passage, notice in verse 5, direct in their planning, they have this delicate relationship with the people. This delicate relationship that is, we fear that if during this celebration of unleavened bread and the Passover, which in the Jewish holy days was celebrated together, back to back here, this week of celebration, during this major holy days where there would be massive crowds flooding Jerusalem, where there would be Messiah expectations on high, where they said, we're not going to do it during this time frame. Because of their delicate relationship with the crowds, we have to be careful here. We're nervous. We have fear relating to them and us. And so we got to be really delicate with this relationship. Fear is a funny thing, right? It's very often to think that is a little bit outside of our control, that we want to be able to control, we fear it. And they fear right here this aspect of the crowds in this relationship, and we're fearful of them. We want kind of them back on our side, and if we're not careful here, we'll sway to Jesus' side. And so we have to do this delicate dance with the crowd that they fear so much. You know, it's one of those things for them, we could say even this morning, wanting other people to respect you, wanting to be seen in high esteem of others isn't completely an evil thing, right? We want to act a certain way that engenders respect and whatnot. But that good thing, if you will, that becomes an ultimate thing, it turns into a terrible master. If I live I want to be respected by you, and I get dressed up a little bit on Sunday, and I try to be respectable in my behavior publicly, that's not all bad. But if I live for the approval of others, my whole heart is, I want your applause, I want your respect, and I will do anything for it, it turns into a very ugly master. A very ugly master. Self-centered love that's about me. It says you have to pay for me. That's this opening illustration of it in this passage. Self-centered love that says you pay for me. Let's move to that second aspect of the illustration in this section here. The second illustration is of the opposite, of a selfless love that says I will pay for you. We see it here in this next section, verse 6 and following. There's kind of two players here. These next two are very close. We move into the very individual names of people that are on display for us. Actually, the first one is unnamed, but it's an individual. Here's a nameless woman. She comes into Jesus, who's having this Passover holy day celebration with his disciples here. And it's one of those things where it's probably how detailed we want to be here. The traditional picture you see of Jesus sitting at a table with his disciples spread out right here. That's probably it's basically it's an erroneous portrayal of how it would have been done there. Typically, there would have been low tables in a U. Jesus would have been sitting at probably that middle table. The servers would have served from the middle of the U, and they would have been reclining on their left side, because their left hand is unclean, with their feet kind of kicked out to the side and having supper this way. It was the typical tradition of that time period, reclining with his disciples in a U-shaped pattern here. And into this setting of this very special ceremonious meal, in comes a woman. She comes in with an alabaster flask of very costly, and it says fragrant oil. She was the essential oil saleswoman of her day. And she comes in with this scented stuff, right? And some of you that know the essential oils of our day, you know how costly they are. This was a very costly thing that she had with her. Perhaps you also are aware that if you know anybody with essential oils, you know that it gives off quite a fragrance. So however discreetly she may have come in, however discreetly she may have been doing this to Jesus, as soon as she breaks open the top of that flask and starts using it, I mean, you can just imagine the pungent smells that are filling the room. So it wouldn't have gone unnoticed in any way with the disciples. It would have filled the room. And you see verse 8 here, a very strong reaction from the disciples. It says here, they were indignant. They were beyond upset with what's going on here. Why? Why? Matthew doesn't say this. He says it's very costly, but both Mark and John's gospel says this about that alabaster flask, because we go, oh, it's costly. What does that mean? In Mark and John, they both say this could have been sold for 300 denarii. Let me just put that in perspective. That is a whole year's wages of an average worker. A year's amount of your salary. It's spilled out in a moment here on Jesus Christ. Let me put that in perspective for a moment here. Pause to consider this with me. This poured out in a moment in front of Jesus. If you came here today and you put an offering in the offering box and you go home to your wife and say, honey, I just gave a year of my wages to the church. I think you'd have some counseling with me this week, right? If that was the case going on today. And let me just say this. Probably that's very unrealistic. Let me just say it another way. If this week you drive home with a brand new truck, gentlemen, you just spent this 60, 70,000 plus on a truck, you drive into your home, and if you think your wife's going to be excited about that, we're also going to have some counseling conversations this week, okay? My point is, this is extravagant. This is something that, like, in that moment of decision by this woman, this would have been her probably almost definitively, this would have been her most costly possession. And she pours it out on Jesus. Over the top generosity. And so, like you could imagine, if you're married here or you're the wife here, or you just imagine that scenario of coming home with a truck that was just over the top, like, what are you doing? Or you give this ridiculous amount to the church. Or if you do those things, you can see quickly here the disciples saying, this is ridiculous. This is over the top generous, and this is in the border of wrong. This shouldn't be done. The disciples respond, we could have used this for the poor. I mean, the benevolence fund would have been full in amazing ways, all the things that they could do. But what does Jesus do? Jesus responds here. And let me just say here, again, a little bit of an apology for not letting you guys into the context of this moment. But in the end of chapter 25, I want you to notice that Jesus had just taught, and he had praised of the future people of his kingdom. And he had said to them in chapter 25, near the end of it, he says in verse 35, when I was hungry, you fed me. You guys familiar with this text? Verse 35, Jesus said, when I was hungry, you fed me. And they say, what are you talking about? We never were with you. This future generation that ends up in the kingdom. When did we didn't do this. And Jesus says in verse 40, when you did it to the least of these my brethren, when you fed the poor and the needy, when you did it to them, you did it to me, Jesus said. And so in no way, in the context is Jesus here saying, the poor, you don't need to do anything to them. He had just elevated that to an amazing height to say, when you do that to them, you do that to me. It's remarkable. And so perhaps if we give the disciples a little bit of space here, we may go, oh, they're just responding with anger because they've just heard how elevated it is to serve the poor. That's like doing it unto Jesus. And so if we give them a little space here, maybe that's why the disciples are so indignant. But here he says, though the poor he is just elevated, he says here, you'll always have the poor with you. And right here he says, and he praises this woman for her generous, selfless love because he knows his time is short. He knows that he's going to the cross in a couple short days here. He knows that his time is so near. This woman has given her most costly possession. She has literally poured it out on Jesus. This selfless act of love that says, I am going to pay to honor you. That's what love is on display here. She's being Christ-like before it's even a term. She's putting this on display in this text. So this is example number 2. And followed closely with it is another individual. And our third point today is back to the path of self-centered love, which says, you pay for me. Back to that, we turn to the next section here. We meet Judas, or we see Judas once again. He's one of Jesus' own disciples. And along with the other disciples here, he's indignant with the woman. He is angry that what she did was wasting, verse number 9 says. Now what's interesting is if you go to chapter 12 of John, you realize in John specifically notes that it was Judas himself who voiced this. Judas was the spokesman for the group, and it goes on to say why. In John 12, it notes that Judas was the treasurer of the group. He kept the money bag. And the text goes on to say he was greedy and deceptive, and he would take from that money bag for his own use. So he would pocket some of the money. And so his was purely not a self-righteous or a righteous response to this woman's extravagance. For in many ways, John highlights it was a pure selfish note from Judas. This would have been a huge opportunity. Man, someone just gave a year's giving. The pot's full. They'll never notice some coins gone from that bag, right? That's Judas's response here in this context. This seems to be the last straw for Judas. He goes from this moment, and he goes where? Directly to the chief priest. Verse 14 tells us his first opportunity, and he says to them, I'm your guy, right? I'm your man. As soon as you're ready, I'm going to find an opportunity, and we're going to make this thing happen. But I want you to notice here, what's the motivation? What's the orientation of his love? It's self-centered, but what specifically is on display here? In the context of Judas here, we see that in this text here, it says, what is he after? What will you give me if I do? He's after money. He wants to be paid for his services. He's not going to do this for free, right? And Judas here says, what will you give me? Think about this for a moment. Judas had traveled with the Messiah, Jesus, for about 3 years now. He had heard his powerful teaching. He had witnessed his miraculous healings. He had seen amazing things done in front of his very eyes. And what does he say here in this text? I value money over him. I value my money and me more than I do him. I love me more. What will you pay me and I'll betray him? For me to win, you're going to have to pay. This self-centered love. That's the cry of sacrifice in love is not what will I have to pay, but what will you pay for me? Judas and betrayal from the inside. That if you've ever been betrayed from someone close to you, you know it cuts much deeper than an outsider. Here in this text is what Judas does with pure self-centered love. You pay for me. Now let's look at the fourth aspect here, the path of selfless love again. Now this back to this, I will pay for you. We see it in the person of Jesus here. And let me point out as we walk into this text from verse 17 and following that centers us on Jesus here in this passage. Let me just be clear. A key point here is this. Talking about self-centered love versus selfless love, let me say this. If Jesus is kind of sensing things or kind of starting to really spin out of his control, if Jesus is here going, I'm going to die anyway, but I'm going to put a spin on this so it appears like I'm being selfless, it's not true selfless love, is it? Selfless love requires this voluntary sacrifice for somebody else. If someone takes it from you, it's not your volition. It's not your love that did it. It's just you trying to spin it like it was your love. So it's key here to point out if Jesus is getting his life taken from him, we can't consider it a love gift. We can't consider it that way. It's an important point here, and Matthew's careful to point that out in this text. Matthew has done this before. We saw it with triumphal entry where Jesus is orchestrating the event line by line before it happens. In this particular text, once again, we see Matthew putting on display Jesus as the sovereign king in control so that when we see his love, we see it truly as a selfless act of love, not just something that's taken from him, but it's something he is willingly giving. I want you to notice here in this passage, the religious leaders, remember from the opening verses, the religious leaders say what? We're going to get Jesus. They're plotting it out, but they're saying what? Hey, this is a feast time. It's dangerous and pivotal with the crowds. We're going to wait until after. Remember that conversation they had earlier? Now what happens? What changes the timetable? There's an inside man that comes forward, and now the timetable is amped up. Now when Judas is discovered here in the Lord's Supper, the timetable, now I'm on, he knows, and I've got to go do this right now tonight. So the timetable is dramatically changed from what they had been plotting. Jesus is in control. Notice that many times in this text, from verse 2, he says, my crucifixion is in front of me. Notice in verse 12, he refers to his burial. Notice in verse 21, he says, one of you is going to betray me. Notice in verse 26 through 28, my body is going to be broken. My blood is going to be shed. Jesus is saying specific detail after specific detail after specific detail before it takes place. Jesus is not taken by surprise here. Matthew is putting that on display for us, that Jesus is sovereignly in control, that he is willingly self-giving his love for others in this text. His sacrifice is not taken from him, it is willingly given. We see in this text the sovereign, self-giving love of Jesus contrasted with pure human evil, volitional evil from their own heart, but pure evil on display, self-centered love that says, you pay for me. I want you to notice a couple things about Jesus' love here. This self-giving, this selfless love that Jesus puts on display, saying, I will pay for you. First, it's a love that knows. I want you to notice this in verse 17 through 25. Jesus says very clearly in this text, when they gather around the meal, Matthew highlights, Jesus knows one of you is going to betray me. They go, well, what are you talking about? He says, it's a person that's going to dip their hand with me. All he's saying there is, it's somebody at this meal that's present. It's an insider. It's one of you. And then they start to ask him, what? Lord, is it I? They're shocked by this statement. They go, Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I? He comes to Judas. And he looks Judas in the eye. Judas may have had the 30 pieces of silver in his pocket, right? And like, notice the change, a little bit of a change here. Rabbi, is it I? This is what the false teacher has been addressing him as basically in chapter 21 and 22 that we've looked at before. Rabbi, is it I? And he says here kind of a cryptic yes. You have said it. You said, or you said it. Notice, just real quickly, just for curiosity's sake, chapter 26, verse 64. When Jesus is on trial by the high priest and they're accusing him, verse 64, he says the exact same Greek phrase here. In my translation says, it is as you said. It's not translated even the same way, but it's the exact same Greek words. You said, Judas, he says to Judas, and before it's Caiaphas, he said, you said, and it's the pivotal moment where they go, blasphemy, and they take Jesus out to be crucified. Matthew is tying Judas's betrayal directly to the cross of Jesus here in chapter 26. It directly ties the two together. Judas' betrayal leads to the cross. In other words, Jesus knows in this text, you are going to fail, you are going to sin, and you are going to sin epically. I mean, this is like if you go, an epic sin out there, you go Judas betraying Jesus. Insider stabbing his master in the back. Epic sin. But the knowledge of it, love that knows, and secondly, love that gives. We looked at the Lord's Prayer, last week with Josh Jensen. One of the phrases in the Lord's Prayer is, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now, Jesus didn't just help us to pray those words, like, say those words. Jesus lives out those words here in this text. Jesus put that kind of love and forgiveness into action. And remember, in the context, he's just told Judas and made it known that there's going to be epic sin. Epic sin in the context here. And then what does Jesus go on to say? Verse 26. He takes the Passover meal that they're celebrating together and he puts a totally different focus on it, a totally new meaning on those words from the Passover meal. He says, "This is my body, which is broken for you. This is my blood that's shed for you." And I want you to notice, it's for who? It's not for the good people out there. Who's it for? Those who, verse 28 says, it's being shed for many for the remission of sins. And in the context, epic sins. Betrayal of the Messiah kind of sins. When you think about the kind of sins that Jesus is going to forgive, sometimes we're like, oh, he'll forgive the little white sins, the little kind sins. I forgot to say please or thank you, or whatever else you can think of, something that's really light. In this context, his blood is being shed, his body's being broken, his blood's being shed for epic sin, all the way down to the little sin. Sin is sin. This is a passage that they're celebrating the Passover meal. It was a time of looking back to the Exodus event, Exodus 12. There's the scene of slaves in Egypt, and remember the last plague that comes. Now in some of the earlier aspects of the plagues, it was happening to Pharaoh and his people, but the people of Israel were kind of shielded from it. But in the last plague, when the death angel is going to come and full justice is going to be unleashed, that full justice cannot be avoided by anyone. When the full justice of God is unleashed in that final plague, what does God tell Moses and the people of Israel? He says, you better put the sacrificial lamb and you put it with the blood over your doorposts, and that's the only way, because when justice is fully unleashed, justice is for everyone. And if you don't put the blood over your doorpost, your firstborn will die. Here in the text here, the reminder of the Passover meal was a celebration of that they got passed over from the death angel because of the blood of the lamb. Jesus here is changing that entire scene from looking back on the Passover lamb and the deliverance of God to now looking to a future deliverance from a totally different lamb. He says, this is my body. This is my blood. He changes it entirely. The focus is now on him and the deliverance that he will bring. And I want you to notice it's not just, there's already been hints of this moving forward. Look with me, if you will. We got a few minutes here. Look with me at Jeremiah 31. Keep your finger here. Go back to the Old Testament, Jeremiah 31. Here, Jeremiah the prophet is writing, and he's been noting that there has been failure from the first covenant. This calling out of people for his name, the Exodus certainly evidences this major factor of them being the covenant people of God, from God's good work to them. But the people have failed, and they need a new covenant. Jeremiah 31, verse 31 says, "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law in their minds. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No more shall every man teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me. From the least of them to the greatest of them, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more." This is the language Jesus uses in our context here. A new covenant through his blood, and through it there's going to be forgiveness. The people had broken the old covenant. They were unfaithful to it. And they needed a heart change, not just outward obedience to conform to the model. Jesus is leading the way, and he speaks of his death being the means by which this new covenant would be written. It's amazing here in this text. There's irony and there's contrast back and forth. And I believe that Matthew wants to use that irony and those contrasts to bring clarity, to help us to see the focus on the orientation of God's love. Love always involves sacrifice. It always involves sacrifice. The question is your heart one that says, hey, you have to pay for me? I'm self-preserving. I'm self-focused in my life. And so others are going to pay the price for me. And we would never say that, but we live that way in our actions. Or is it an I will pay for you, selfless love? What is the orientation of your heart? This text begins to put clarity on those issues. It's a hard question to answer, isn't it? When you think about your own heart, it's a deceptive thing, isn't it? My heart's a deceptive thing. It's hard to answer the question, what kind of heart do we have? Because we can do good things. Even in the context here, the religious leaders thought they were doing a good thing. They were being very, very religious in their betrayal of Jesus. Judas was being very, very selfish and more classically selfish. But both were being absolutely selfish, whether it be lots of good things or whether it be, I just want money. Our heart can be deceptive in that way. It's why it's so important for us to realize that the text here pointing to the selfless heart is not for you to just try to turn over a new leaf, not for you just to try harder from yourself. It is that you need a new heart. You need a new heart like Jeremiah wrote about, that Jesus is referring to, and you need it to happen. It can only happen through the work of Jesus on your behalf. We cannot clean our own hearts. We need the work of Jesus so that judgment and justice might pass over us. And I want you to notice here, this is the work that he promises. Verse 29, I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now until the day when I drink of it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Jesus makes a solemn pledge here. I will fulfill my promise. I will keep my word. He's lovingly going to give himself for sinners. It's how this narrative points us forward to the cross as we walk our way there together. The question I have for you today is, will you receive this love? This orientation of love that's given for you. Will you let that love transform you? Will you let it take a self-oriented heart and turn it into a selfless heart? Not saying you pay for me, but saying I will pay for you. This is the gospel story that puts a focus on it here in Matthew 26. Let me pray with you. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the Word of God. I thank you that this Word is powerful. It is able to show hearts exposed before you. Lord, it's not about hearts being exposed before me. It's about our hearts knowing you. And in this text before us, we see such contrasts. Two of each, this aspect of self-centeredness, whether it be very, very religious or very, very, very irreligious. It describes each of our hearts that we are self-oriented, and it'll come out in different ways. And God, I just pray that you might help anyone here that's never received the transformed heart through the gospel of Jesus, that today might be the day where they say, you know what? Deep down, I do see today some aspects that my heart's self-centered. My heart is bent towards my own glory and not the glory of God. I pray that you take believers here today. Lord, the reality is, yes, we have a transformed heart through Jesus, but Lord, that we'd walk in the confidence and the changing work of the Spirit day by day, because it's so easy for anyone here, a believer especially, to go back to their old master and to live life in a way that is extremely self-oriented. I pray, God, you'd grow us in you. I pray that this aspect of Christ-likeness that this woman displays in this passion might characterize us. That the aspect of I will pay for you is the relationships we have in our marriages and our families. That it's not you have to pay for me, but I will take the blow and then I will forgive. I will not return the blow to you. God, I pray that you might characterize your people by your word, this selfless love. Lord, thank you for what you have done in us. Lord, there's so many here today that can testify to the transforming work of the Spirit. And I pray, God, you'd work in hearts, that they might have confidence to take a booklet in the back or set up a time to talk to me today or this week, and that they would make sure their heart is right before you. Lord, thank you for the gospel. Thank you for the transforming work of Jesus. Thank you for the promises made that this is going to be the case in this text. And as we see in the days ahead, this will be the work that Jesus goes to and he does in our behalf, so that we might receive the remission, the forgiveness of sins. We're so thankful, Lord, for the gospel. We want to make much of it in Jesus' name.